Alrighty, how's everybody doing? Awesome. Well, tonight we have an extremely special evening. Tonight is the kickoff for the Veritas Forum, as you can see on the screens there. And there's an incredible amount of great stuff happening this week that Josh was talking about. But I want to take a moment and introduce to you our guest speaker this evening. Tonight we are super privileged to have Andy Bannister speaking here at Lift Church. Now, Andy works and kind of splits his time between RZIM, or Ravi Zacharias International Ministries, which is an apologetics organization that seeks to help people understand what the Christian faith is and why it's grounded. And then he also works in the UK with an organization called SOLAS, doing something similar. Now, Andy is a doctorate. He holds his doctorate in Islamic studies, a topic that he kind of teaches all over the world. He's taught extensively in the UK, in Canada, all over North America, and actually across the world. He is an adjunct professor with a seminary out of Australia, and he's written a number of books that we have for sale at the back as well. So Andy is basically a world-class speaker. So this evening, would you guys do a huge favor for me and give a giant Lift Church warm welcome to Andy Bannister this evening? Yeah.
Fantastic. Well, good evening, and thank you for that warm Canadian welcome. In fact, it's fantastic to be back in Canada. My wife and I and family lived in Toronto from 2010 till just last summer. We've now gone back to the UK, but I'm frequently over here in this part of the world, but haven't been in Toronto actually since July, so it felt like kind of coming home. And been Hamilton many times. And for the past week, I've actually been down in America, doing some work down there on Islam and with the Muslim community. But it's always good to come to Canada after America, because unlike our American cousins, you still have the Queen's head on the currency and all of these great things. Although I was saying last week to many American friends, they're all in mourning because of the presidential result. And I have said to many Americans, look, the door is always open to come back and rejoin the Commonwealth. I'm sure the Queen would welcome them back in. And up in Canada, you could give them some advice on how to be part of that global world community rather than a strange bunch of isolationists. Now, bear in mind, when I go to America, I make jokes about Canadians. So this works. This does work. This does work both ways. But no, it's wonderful to be here and to be sharing with you a little bit tonight on some of the importance and really some of the reasons why, for those of us who are Christians or whether we don't have a faith here this evening, why it's a really good idea and really useful and helpful to be talking with and dialoguing with those who think differently to us. And that's something very dear to my heart, actually, because I actually have Muslims to thank for my being a Christian speaker and writer and philosopher and all of those things. You see, by the late 1990s, I hadn't really thought about sharing my faith. I hadn't really thought about my Christian heritage that much. I was a youth worker for a group of churches in London, England, and anybody who's only done any kind of youth work in church settings or secular settings will know that all you really need to do to work with young people is have a really sharp stick and ideally some chocolate for bribery. And then one day, someone came and did a presentation on my church on understanding Islam. And this speaker, one of the things he talked about was how on the weekends he was heading up a team of people going to a place in London called Speaker's Corner. And if you've never heard of Speaker's Corner, it's kind of the world centre of free speech. It's a part of one of our big parks in London where hundreds, sometimes even thousands of people come, and on a weekend you can stand on a ladder or a soapbox and you can talk about anything, religion, politics, sport, you'll gain a crowd. And he and a few others were using this as an opportunity to engage Muslims there on the street, to talk about their Christian faith with Muslims. And after he'd finished his presentation, I said to him, I went up and spoke to him, and I said, this sounds fascinating. He said, well, why don't you come to Speaker's Corner next week, Andy, and see what we do? And so I thought, this sounds great. And so the following week, I went to Hyde Park, I went to Speaker's Corner in London, not knowing that this gentleman's definition of the term, come and see what we do, actually meant stand on a ladder and preach in public next to him. And so I got to the train station, and he met me there. He went, oh, Andy, I've brought a spare ladder for you. And I thought this was a comment about my height, but no, it wasn't. It was he thought it would be a good idea to put the rookie up. And so there I went. There were 300 Muslims there that day come to listen to us, and they were well practiced in the art of heckling and asking difficult questions and making Christians look stupid. And they proceeded to do so. And I went home from Speaker's Corner that day, my kind of tail between my legs, thinking, maybe I need to become a Muslim. Because these guys have all of the answers, they're very passionate, they're very bold. I know absolutely nothing. And I lay awake that night in bed, tossing and turning. And about 3 a.m, my long-suffering wife kind of nudged me in the ribs and said, why are you tossing and turning, keeping us both awake? And I told her my sad little story. And her wise advice was, why don't you read a book? Ideally in the morning. I thought it was a good idea. So the following morning, I went to the local bookstore and I bought my first book on how I might start thinking about my faith as a Christian more intellectually, how I could answer some of the questions my Muslim friends had asked me. And I read, and I read, and I read, and I read. I spent the next 2 weeks, it seems, reading every spare moment, and I got answers to every question I'd been asked at Speaker's Corner. And I went back to Speaker's Corner 2 weeks later, loaded for bear. I was ready for them. And they had new questions. And they made me look stupid all over again. And we repeated this little game for the next 3 months. I would go to Speaker's Corner on a weekend, I would be humiliated in public, and I would go home, I would read. But through that, something happened. And through that, as a Christian, I firmly believe that God did something. That God gave me a love of thinking through the answers to some of the biggest questions about the Christian faith, but also a love of dialoguing with people who think differently, be they Muslims or atheists or whoever. And of course, that led for me, as you heard in the introduction, to actually doing a PhD in Islamic studies. So the moral of that story is be careful what ladders you stand on weekends, because it can change your academic career. But I'm really grateful for that experience, because it set me up in many ways for the career path that followed, of going around to university campuses and other places and speaking to audiences, both friendly and hostile. And I think that's important in some ways because, we live in a very pluralistic world, don't we? We live in a world where there are people who believe all kinds of things. Where I lived in Toronto, just down the road, I'm sure the same goes for Hamilton. We're surrounded, aren't we, by people who practice every conceivable religion. Where I lived in Toronto, in fact, back where I live in the UK now, you can choose from all manner of belief systems. Where I was in Toronto, you could choose from Islamism, Buddhism, Hinduism, Sikhism, Jainism, Judaism, secularism, Islamism. You could even be a Maple Leafs fan. Of course, that's masochism. And all kinds of different belief systems. And that raises a very interesting question. In fact, it raises a number of questions, whether you would call yourself a Christian here this evening, or whether you'd consider yourself more of a seeker, a skeptic, just an agnostic, someone who's come along to sort of check out the Christian faith, walk around the car and sort of kick the tires a bit. That plethora of religions raises a question for me. And it's this: what do we do? Do we just ignore the differences? Do we kind of paper over them? Do we try and sort of claim that everybody believes the same and just encourage people not to look too closely? Because when you do, there are obviously differences. And if we're Christians, what do we do? Do we just pretend there aren't other religions? Do we just proclaim that everybody else is right and wrong and we're right and not listen to them? What do we do? How do we engage a world of different belief systems? Now, of course, this question is even more important because we live in a world, we live in an age, don't we, where the chief virtue really that's proclaimed these days is tolerance. The one thing you must do is tolerate other people, right? The one thing you must never do is tell anybody they're wrong. In fact, there was a recent survey done of about 3,000 North American teenagers and young adults, and it really sort of probed into the question of what people believe is right and what people believe is wrong. And the result that these sociologists came across staggered them. They discovered that the biggest sin, as it were, the worst thing you can possibly do for this age group in North America is tell somebody else that they're wrong. That came worse even than watching hardcore pornography, than cheating on your taxes. It came almost equal to not recycling. But tolerance came right there at the top. And I find this really, really interesting because being British, I'm a little bit iconoclastic. I like to go around and poke people with a stick and see what happens and then run away very fast. But I often like to try and sort of, particularly on university campuses, sort of mildly annoy people by saying, I'm not a great fan of the word tolerance. Maybe it's because being British, I know I'm superior, but no, that's another thing. One or two people looking rather sort of suspiciously at me. Was joking, honestly, slightly joking. And in fact, if I could remove one word from the dictionary, I often like to say I would remove the word tolerance. Why? Seriously, why would I do that? Well, here's the reason. I don't actually think tolerance is a virtue. And I don't think so for this reason. What is it we generally tolerate? What do we generally tolerate? We generally tolerate something that's a little bit beneath us, and particularly something that couldn't do better than it's done. Good example, I have a 4-year-old daughter, I have a 20-month-old son. My 20-month-old son has just discovered it's really good fun to draw on the walls. And so we've had to lock down every possible writing implement in the house and repaint in a couple of places. But when he does that, well, I guess I tolerate it. He's 20 months old, he couldn't do any better. When the dog, pees on the couch for the 3rd time in a week, we kind of tolerate it. It's an animal. In other words, we tolerate things that are beneath us. What should we do when we come across a human being who believes something fundamentally different to us? I want to suggest that tolerance is not the right word. It's a deeply arrogant word. Perhaps instead we should be listening. We should be asking questions. We should be dialoguing and discussing. In fact, I put it to you that nobody in this room here tonight wants to be tolerated. What you want to be is respected, listened to, and taken seriously. And I don't know about you, I don't mind if somebody says to me, Andy, I think you're wrong, if they can give me reasons and are willing for me to engage and discuss. So I think tolerance is a rather unhelpful place to begin in some respects on this. But obviously I'm a Christian speaker. Here we are at a church this evening. And so I want to think a little bit about what does the Bible have to say to help us think about how we might engage those who think differently. And so what I'm going to do this evening is read to you from a very famous passage of the New Testament. If you do have a Bible with you this evening, perhaps you've got something on your iPhone, or if you've got one of those Android things, if it's not currently catching fire, you might use that. And it also means if the sermon gets boring, you can play Candy Crush Saga or some such thing. But I can see everyone from up here, so just I know where you are. I'm going to read to you from Acts chapter 17, verses 16 through 34. And then I'm going to pull out of here some thoughts on how we might learn from this and engaging with those who think differently, and hopefully some takeaways here, whether you would call yourself a Christian here this evening, or as I say, a seeker, a skeptic, an agnostic, or just someone who turned left rather than right and is wondering why this isn't a chemistry lecture. Unlikely to be the case on Sunday night. But there we are. Actually, never do that joke again. Nobody laughed. Right, Acts 17, verse 16 through 34. Long passage, but I hope you'll follow along, because it's one of my favorite stories in the New Testament, actually. While Paul was waiting for them in Athens, he was greatly distressed to see that the city was full of idols. So he reasoned in the synagogue with the Jews and the God-fearing Greeks, as well as those in the marketplace day by day with those who happened to be there. A group of Epicurean and Stoic philosophers began to debate with him. Some of them asked, "What is this babbler trying to say?" Others remarked, "He seems to be advocating foreign gods." They said this because Paul was preaching the good news about Jesus and the resurrection. Then they took Paul and they brought him to a meeting of the Areopagus where they said to him, "May we know what this new teaching is that you are presenting? You are bringing some very strange ideas to our ears, and we want to know what they are." All the Athenians and the foreigners who lived there spent their time doing nothing but talking about and listening to the latest ideas. Paul then stood up in the meeting of the Areopagus and he said, "Men of Athens, I see that in every way you are very religious. For as I walked around and I looked carefully at your objects of worship, I even found an altar with this inscription, to an unknown God. Now what you proclaim as unknown, what you worship as unknown, I am going to proclaim to you. The God who made the world and everything in it is the Lord of heaven and earth, and he does not live in temples built by hands. And he is not served by human hands as if he needed anything, because he himself gives all people life and breath and everything else. From one man he made every nation of men, that they should inhabit the whole earth, and he determined the time set for them and the exact places where they should live. God did this so that people would seek him and perhaps reach out for him and find him, though God is not far from each one of us. For in him we live and move and have our being. Indeed, as some of your own poets have said, we are his offspring. Therefore, since we are God's offspring, we should not think that the divine being is like gold or silver or stone, an image made by man's design and skill. In the past, God overlooked such ignorance, but now he commands all people everywhere to repent. For he has set a day when he will judge the world with justice by the man he has appointed. He has given proof of this to all men by raising him from the dead." When they heard about the resurrection of the dead, some of them sneered, but others said, we want to hear you again on this subject. At that, Paul left the council. A few people became followers of Paul, and they believed. Among them was Dionysius, a member of the Areopagus, also a woman named Damaris, and a number of others. Very famous story there, back in the 1st century, just within a few decades after the resurrection of Jesus. There's Paul there in Athens, in Greece, the center of the ancient world, the kind of Toronto, the London, the New York of its day, engaging the Areopagus, which was where the philosophers and the thinkers, the greatest minds of the day would meet and gather and debate. And there Paul, surrounded by people who think profoundly differently to him, engages in a presentation about the gospel, about Christianity, and some interesting results flow from that. And what I want to do this evening is to pull out for you briefly and quickly 5 observations I think we can make about the way that Paul goes about this expedition to Athens, the way he engages the Athenians and the Greeks there who didn't believe what he believed, that I think can give us some thoughts about how we too might think about talking with, dialoguing with, sharing with those who don't share our worldview. As I say, whether we're Christians here this evening or we use a different label to describe ourselves. So the first thing that Paul does, that I think is very, very interesting, is he begins by observing. If you read the passage carefully, it's become apparent that he's wandered around Athens. He's done the tourist thing. He's gone and looked at the great monuments and the temples, probably taken a few photographs and uploaded them on his iPhone. And archaeologists have uncovered stone iPhones, there in the Greek ruins. And never do that joke again either, Andy. And he's observed carefully. And I think there's something important here, because one of the mistakes we can sometimes make when we try and engage those who think differently is we open our mouths and we spout out something without first checking out what the other person says. We live in an age where it's very easy to do this. We live in an age where people stereotype other people, where people make assumptions. I've been on the receiving end of that as a Christian. At times, perhaps I've been guilty of that. Before I went to Speaker's Corner in the 1990s there, I probably had assumptions about what Muslims believe that were proved wrong out of some of my conversations with them. A couple of years ago, I wrote a book on atheism, and I had the privilege of talking with many atheist thinkers and philosophers as I put that book together. And I confess I had some assumptions about some of what my atheist friends believe that were wrong. And I wouldn't have found out that I was wrong. I wouldn't have found out what they really believed or didn't believe unless I'd taken the time to actually go and look and talk to them. And I think this is a huge challenge in the culture that we live in today. Here in Canada, we're very, very pluralistic. But if we're honest, many of us only spend our times talking to those who think the same as we do. Technology has made that easier, quite frankly. No matter what sort of you believe, you can find other people on social media who believe the same as you do, and you can just hang out talking to them. And for many of us, if we're honest, our social media feeds have become just an echo chamber. So the first thing I want to encourage you to think about this evening is how often, how frequently are you talking, engaging with, sharing with, dialoguing with, finding out about those who don't think the same as you do, whether you're a Christian here or whether you're not. You see, everybody has a worldview. Everybody has a belief system. And one of the most interesting things you can do with your friends, your colleagues, your classmates is find out what it is. Everybody believes something, even my atheist friends. I've got a friend of mine back in the UK who's a GP. He was telling me a story very interesting on that last point, very interestingly. He said when he first began practicing as a family doctor, as a GP, general practitioner, he was a Christian. And one of the things he would often find himself doing is he'd find himself getting in trouble from his colleagues and his peers, and he'd be accused of bringing his Christian faith into the consulting room. Why? Well, for this reason. He felt very strongly about the issue of abortion. And he felt that as a Christian GP, it wasn't right for him to refer patients for that procedure. And instead, he would pass them on to one of his colleagues. And he would often find people saying to him, Mark, this is a bad idea. You mustn't do this. You can't bring your worldview, your belief system into the consulting room. Instead, you should let the patient make her own decision as to whether or not she keeps the baby or she destroys it. That would be neutrality. And he said, for many years, I was troubled by that because I sort of didn't know how to respond. I knew something was inherently wrong with that. And then he said, one day, he realized what it was. He said, the belief that you can just make a sort of detached decision about whether or not to end a life through abortion. And the idea that's neutrality is a fallacy, because that's a belief system, and that's a worldview, and it's coming into the consulting room. And he said, once I realized that my patients had their right, absolutely, to bring their beliefs into the consulting room, I felt much more relaxed about being able to do it as a doctor. And I just tell you that story to encourage you to think about the fact that everybody has a belief system. Everybody has a worldview, whether it's a religious one, if you're a Christian, or even if you're agnostic or an atheist or whatever, you have deeply held beliefs. Let's take the time to find out what each other believe, and then we can have conversations that really count. So that was the first thing. Paul checked out. He observed. Secondly, what Paul did here in Acts 17 that I think is really interesting to think about, especially for Christians here tonight, is Paul went to the heart of the culture. Interesting to look at that in Acts 17. He didn't sort of just stand preaching on the street corner. He didn't just go and hang out in the Jewish synagogue or find where the Christians were hanging out. He gets to Athens and he decides the place he wants to go is the Areopagus. That's the equivalent of Ottawa. That's the equivalent of Washington. That's the equivalent of Westminster for me back home. He went to the center of power. He didn't run away. He didn't think, well, gosh, I'm a Christian. I've got nothing to say to those who shape and influence culture. Rather, he made a beeline for the influencers, a beeline for the thinkers, a beeline for the most brilliant minds he could find. And you see, there's a myth that I hear sometimes in our contemporary postmodern culture that, religion belongs in the private sphere. If you're a Christian, if you're a Muslim, if you're a Hindu, or if you're a Jew, if you have any kind of religious faith, that's great, that's fine, that's wonderful. Practice it in private, but don't bring it into the public square. What could Christianity possibly have to say to the world of education, the world of politics, the world of the media? And the answer I want to say is actually quite a lot. Because I think the fundamental reason why I'm a Christian is because it's true. And if the Christian faith is true, then it can stand up. It can stand up to competing ideas on the university campus. It can stand up to competing ideas in the world of the media or politics or wherever. And one of the things that excites me about what's happening here at McMaster University over this next week with this Veritas week you've got going on is different ideas are going to be portrayed. I think it's on the Thursday night. You've got this dialogue on science, haven't you? Where you've got a Christian speaker, you've got a Muslim speaker, you've got an atheist speaker. And I love events like that because it's a wonderful opportunity to put worldviews into dialogue with each other and to show how I think the Christian faith stands up. So if you're a Christian here this evening, I'd encourage you, don't hide your Christian faith. Don't feel that it's not something you can talk about on the campus or talk about with your friends and your colleagues and your peers and your professors if you're a student here. Christianity is a public truth. And equally, if you're not a Christian here this evening, don't think about religion as something private. Think about religion as a public truth claim. And the thing that you should be doing as an agnostic or a seeker or a skeptic is not thinking to yourself, does Christianity, when I come to Lift Church, does it give me a kind of warm, fuzzy feeling? Ask yourself the question, is it true? And if it's true, there's only one response. You should believe it, and you should follow the evidence where it leads. So Paul observed, number one. Paul, secondly, he went to the heart of the worldview. Thirdly, something he does here in Athens that to me is so important for Christians particularly to get a handle on, but others of us too, he built bridges to his audience. And it's interesting, as he was walking around Athens, it's one of my favorite scenes in the book of Acts here in the New Testament, when Paul comes across his altar to an unknown God. The Athenians were very, very religious. We think we have a postmodern pluralistic country here in Canada. I tell you, we know nothing compared to the ancient world. The Athenians had every religion conceivable. They worshipped every god they could find. And in fact, in the ancient world, if you heard about a new deity, all you did is you started worshipping it along with all the others you were already worshipping. They were very, very pluralistic. But even the Athenians were worried, maybe we've missed one. We've got all of these altars and temples and goodness knows what, but what if there is some God out there we've missed, and that's the really important one, and we really annoy that God by not worshipping him or her? I know what we do. We put an altar up to the unknown God. So the Athenians built this thing. In fact, archaeologists have discovered it. If you ever go to Greece, to Athens, you can go and see the altar to the unknown God, which brings a wonderful kind of sort of historical angle on this story here. Now, Paul, of course, was a Jew. And Jews, like Christians and Muslims, are monotheistic. So you'd have expected Paul to find the altar of the unknown God and go, oh my good grief, these Athenians are a nightmare. They're worshipping anything. If it moves, they worship it. If it doesn't move, they still worship it. What am I going to do? And I almost expected Paul to have stood up before the Areopagus and gone, you load of completely uneducated pagans, what on earth are you doing? But he doesn't. He starts by praising their religiosity. He says, you guys are so religious. You're so spiritual. This is wonderful. I'm so encouraged. Extremely unusual when you think about Paul. But I love it because it gives us a real insight into a great way to build bridges and build dialogues. Even if the person you're talking with believes something vastly different to you, start by looking for the things you can find in common. Yes, there are massive differences between the different religions of the world. Between Islam and Christianity, there are huge differences. But I have things in common with my Muslim friends. And when I meet a new Muslim friend, when I'm speaking on universities, and perhaps I'm having lunch with a Muslim professor, I'll often try and start by going, what can I find in common? What can I affirm? Where can we find some bridges to build from? The same goes when Christians and atheists talk with each other. Rather than just slinging, insults and one-liners at each other, what about trying to find some places we can agree? What about trying to find some sort of causes, around justice or, human rights or the environment or whatever it be, where we can stand alongside each other and go, you know what, we think the same on these issues, and then move to the differences. So bridge building is incredibly important, and we've got a wonderful model of how to do it here in this encounter that Paul has back in the first century. So he observed, he went to the power centers, he engaged the thinkers. Thirdly, he built bridges. Fourthly, and penultimately for you, one of the things he does here in Athens that I love is Paul gives reasons. He gives reasons for his beliefs. So he starts with what's in common, and then he gives this very carefully worked out little argument for the Christian faith. And of course, you've got to remember who he was standing in front of. Athens was the jewel intellectually in the crown of the classical world. It was the cultural center to which artists and philosophers and thinkers would flock. And faced with this very, very bright audience, Paul gives this carefully constructed argument for the Christian faith, beginning with the nature of God, moving through who humans are, and then drawing on nature. He draws on philosophy. He even quotes the Athenians' own poets to them. There are two quotes from classical Greek poets there in Paul's little sermon. And I love the fact that he gives reasons, because I think that's something really important to understand this evening. It's another area where both those of us who are Christians and also those of us who are perhaps checking out the Christian faith can go wrong. We can forget that ultimately Christianity is something, you can give reasons for. And that's a fascinating idea because it cuts against the grain in some ways of the way that we're encouraged to think about Christianity as 21st century moderns. We live in an age, don't we, where in many ways the concept of truth has been eroded. In fact, we live in a post-truth age, the media are telling me, since the Trump-Clinton fiasco. We've replaced truth with feelings. We've segued from, I think, therefore I am, to I emote, therefore I feel. Smiley face, LOL, etc., etc. Now, Christians are not immune from this. I'm not just beating up on the culture here. This has crept into the church. And the way I illustrate it is this for a moment. It affects sometimes how those of us who are Christians here this evening think about sharing our faith. And imagine, someone comes up to me and says to me, Andy, why are you a Christian? And so without sort of thinking about it, I seamlessly switch into testimony mode, trademark. And I say, well, the reason I'm a Christian is, 20, 25 years ago, in the office I was working, at the cubicle next to me, there was a guy about my age. We became friends. We started playing sport together. We played cricket. That's like baseball, but with classical rules and history. And culture and all kinds of things. And anyway, it turns out he was a Christian. So he invited me one day to this course that was run at his church. It was called Alpha. And I went along and they gave me some lovely food and answered my questions, and I became a Christian. Now, for those of you who are Christians here this evening, what's wrong with that story? Let me illustrate by retelling it to you. About 20 years ago, I became friends with a guy in the cubicle next door to mine at the office I was working in. We became great friends. We started playing cricket together. It's like baseball. No, done that joke. And anyway, it turns out he was a Buddhist. And he invited me to this lovely kind of course that was run at the local Zen Buddhist center. The food was lovely. I love Thai food. And they answered all of my questions about Buddhism. And lo and behold, in time, I became a Buddhist. You see, here's the thing. If those of us who are Christians here this evening, if your answer to the question, why are you a Christian, is the story of how you became one, there's a problem. Because that wasn't the question I was asked. In the example, I was asked, why are you a Christian? And you see, the culture that we live in often encourages us to give how-shaped answers to why-shaped questions, and just to tell our stories. And that's okay so far as it goes, but the problem is everybody has a story, and some of those stories are compelling. There's only one good reason to be a Christian, only got one good reason to be a follower of Jesus Christ, and that's if it's true. And then, of course, for those of us who are Christians, we have to ask ourselves the question, one test of whether we really believe it's true, right down to the very fiber of our being, is if we are willing to then go and share it with our friends and our neighbors and our colleagues and our classmates who don't believe the same thing as us, and think through how to answer their questions and to do so respectfully and with integrity. So Paul observed. He went to the power centers, he built bridges, he gave reasons why. Fifthly and lastly, and I'll draw a few threads together and bring this to a close, Paul didn't compromise on the truth of the gospel. One of the things that we sometimes can think about, I think this is true for both Christians and non-Christians, we sometimes think, if we're going to talk to somebody who doesn't believe the same thing as we do, we're going to have to compromise. We're going to have to water down what we believe in order to find some kind of murky middle ground. And one of the exciting things that 20 years now of dialoguing and engaging and debating and studying and building friendships with Muslims across the world has taught me is you don't have to do that. I've had some incredibly heated conversations with Muslim friends over the years about questions that really matter. But in 20 years, I have never once had a Muslim friend say to me, Andy, I'm offended because you think differently to me or because of what you've said. I've had them tell me that they think I'm wrong. I've had plenty of Muslims tell me that I need to abandon my Christian faith and become a Muslim. And you know what? I respect that. I utterly respect that. I know they believe that, and they know that I wish they would leave their Muslim faith and become a Christian. And I've come increasingly to think that a really good sign of a really good friendship is when you can be friends despite believing things differently. And you don't avoid the differences, because that's not friendship. That's just pushing the things under the carpet. When you can have really robust conversations and still be friends. That's really, really important to get a grasp on. We don't need to compromise what you believe. If you're a Christian here this evening and you begin talking with those who think differently, don't compromise your Christian faith. If you are a skeptic or an agnostic or a seeker here this evening, don't think that you have to pretend to be more interested in religion than you do. Otherwise, you won't be invited back to Lift Church next time the donuts are good. We need to be a community where we can be honest and have real conversations, where those of us who are skeptics and doubters can ask their questions honestly, and where those who are Christians can talk about what we believe honestly and with passion, yet we can still build friendships. So 5 principles for you there out of Acts 17. But one last thing I want to think about as I draw this to a close. Okay, that's all very well, but why do it? Why do it? Maybe some of you are sitting here this evening thinking, this is great, that's fine, that's theoretical. Why? I'm quite comfortable. I don't need to go make friends with people who believe things differently to me. If I wanted, violent disagreements, I'd go and live in America. I mean, this is Canada. Why should we do it? And interestingly, I think for Christians particularly, there's a lot of ambivalence about sharing our faith and talking about what we believe. And as I say, one reason for that, I think, is this sort of fear of causing offense. We're often told there's 2 things you must never talk about. Never talk about religion and never talk about politics. You'll offend people whatever you do. But as I say, I think the best way to overcome that fear is actually just to go out and try it. And you may be very, very surprised to find that your friends and your colleagues, your classmates, your family members who don't share your convictions, actually, if you're willing to listen as much as you talk, are more open than you would realize. But there's another reason why I think as well we really need conversations about the biggest questions of life, about things like Christianity and what is true and what really matters. One reason why we need to model how this looks like is we live in a world that is increasingly skeptical about religion. I probably don't need to tell you that. It's not really rocket science. There was a big survey done last year in North America, and they surveyed, I believe, sort of 5,000 people. And this big multi-month survey discovered that 46% of Americans and Canadians think that religion is the main problem in our world. Not surprising when you look at some of the headlines, right? Interestingly, 42% of people think it's not religion is the problem, it's people of faith is the problem. If you could just rid the world of Muslims and Christians and Hindus and Jews and Maple Leafs fans and everybody else, then we'd solve the problems of the world. Now, that's maybe a topic for another evening, but what I do want to suggest is that one way to overcome, I think, that suspicion of religion is to have more dialogue and more conversations between people who believe differently and show you can do it without it resulting in arguments. Every time you have an event like Thursday night, when you can have an atheist and a Muslim and a Christian stand on a stage, disagree with one another, shake hands, and hopefully go out for a curry afterwards, it models, you know what? Religion doesn't need to be part of the problem. That actually we can have these conversations without them ending in problems. That's one reason. Other reason for Christians here, especially this evening, why we need to have more of these conversations is I'm finding wherever I go, there is an incredible openness to religious faith, incredible openness to Christianity right now. We often miss this because in the West, in countries like Canada, the statistics are fractionally different, but most places you go in the world right now, incredible things are happening. There's an organization called the Pew Forum that do a lot of global surveys on religion and faith and belief, and they just recently put out some interesting figures that show that far from being in decline, which is often the narrative we hear in the media, everywhere you look around the world, religion is growing. It's even beginning to grow here in the West. In fact, the percentage of people who don't believe in any kind of religious faith is predicted to decrease from 16% of the world's population to 13% over the next 20 years or so. We live very much in an age of religion. And we see that everywhere we look. China, for example. Not so many years ago, there was no church to speak of in China. Now there are over 100 million Chinese Christians, and the church is growing rapidly. Or we might look at Africa. In 1900, there were 1 million Christians in Africa. Now there are 460 million, and it's predicted to be 630 million by 2025. Or you look at the Middle East, a region that I'm hugely passionate about. The church in Iran is over 1 million and growing so rapidly, some sociologists are predicting that within 50 years, Iran will become a Christian country. Even in Saudi Arabia now, Christians are beginning to be able to worship more freely than they've ever been because their numbers are so great that the government is beginning to realize that accommodation rather than persecution might be the key. And the list goes on and on and on. And even here, in a country like Canada that we might think of as secular, I find wherever I go to on university campuses, if you put on events with titles that engage people and draw people in, you get packed audiences. And in fact, this week, as well as the events happening here at McMaster, there are weeks of events happening at University of Toronto, at McGill University, at the University of Guelph, Queen's University, and by some estimates, between 8 and 10,000 Canadian students will come to some kind of event around the Christian faith and some of these big questions over the next 5 days. You are part of something much bigger here at McMaster. People are not disinterested in this kind of stuff. The gospel has power. Which brings me to the last point that I want to end with. I mentioned the word gospel there. You know, one of the things you may have noticed if you are a visitor here this evening, if you're an agnostic or a seeker or a doubter or whatever you label yourself as, you may have noticed that Christians like jargon. Have you noticed that? Actually, Christians know that we like jargon. We think it makes us sound more spiritual if we use sort of words that no one else uses and say them in a sort of faintly sort of spiritual tone of voice. But gospel is an interesting word, right? You've probably heard the term gospel. It's used a lot in churches, but interesting, what does it mean? Christians talk about the gospel, preaching the gospel, sharing the gospel of Jesus. You can't avoid that term if you hang around Christians for any length of time. And it's an interesting word, because the word gospel comes from a Greek word, euangelion, and it means good news. That's what the word gospel means. It means good news. And that word that's right at the heart of what Christians believe is interesting because it gets to the heart of something very important that I want to leave you with this evening. I want to read you a quotation as we close. One of my favorite Christian authors, his name is Tom Wright, and I was gratified actually. I was saying to Robin that you've got Tom Wright books on the bookstall out there, so to go, yay, this church is in the right direction. And Tom wrote a wonderful book last year called Simply Good News, and I just want to read you a little paragraph as we begin to wrap this up. Tom writes these words. He says, for all of Paul's talk about God, the Apostle Paul was not urging people or telling people about a new religious system. Nor was he urging them to adopt a new type of morality, nor was he offering a new philosophy, a new theory about the world, how it worked, how we can know things, how we should behave. Certainly other religious teachers at the time were offering things like that, but Paul's approach was different. True, his message would affect those areas, but that was really a side effect. Many people today assume that Christianity is one or more of those things, a religion, a moral system, a philosophy. In other words, they assume that Christianity is about advice, but it wasn't and it isn't. Christianity, quite simply, is good news. It is the news that something has happened, as a result of which the world is a different place. That is what Paul was announcing. One can debate the merits of a religion, a moral system, or a philosophy, but a news event is discussed in different ways. Either the event happened or it didn't. And if it did happen, either it means what people say it means or it doesn't. And that's at the heart of why, certainly for us here who are Christians, we believe that what we need to do, what we can only do, the only possible response to what Jesus did, to the good news of Jesus, is to get out and tell people about it. If you're a Christian here this evening, I hope that this week at McMaster, this Veritas week, will give you an unprecedented opportunity to tell people the news of what Jesus did. Not about Christianity as a philosophy or a way of life or a set of ideas, but news of an event. The event when Jesus, God's Son, stepped into human history to demonstrate what God's love and the forgiveness that's on offer for us. And if you are a seeker or a skeptic or a visitor here this evening, come along to one of those events during the week. Find out more and check out the truth of the Christian faith for yourselves. Thanks for listening. I'm going to close in prayer and then hand back to Robin. Father God, I thank you that we can have conversations like this on a place like McMaster University. I thank you that the gospel of Jesus is a public truth that we can talk about, we can discuss, we can dialogue, we can debate about. But Lord, I pray for each of my friends here this evening, for those who are Christians, that they would get a fresh grasp of the wonderful news that they're sitting on, the dynamite news that the gospel is. And for those here who are visitors, that you would draw them to check it out for themselves, to investigate who Jesus is, and not be afraid of having conversations that count. I pray there will be friendships that are formed this week during the Veritas week here at McMaster between Christians and those who haven't yet discovered Jesus, that will lead to lives being changed here on this campus. We ask this in the name of Jesus. Amen.
Awesome. Thank you, Andy. Can you give it up for Andy?